Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with me for today's devotion. We are wrapping up Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7 this morning. And the truth is, we could talk about this chapter for hours. There is so much that is in here, but I want to focus my comments today on the opening verses where he talks about judging, because this is one of the verses that secular people quote quite often in an attempt to silence Christians or to tell us we shouldn't judge people in, say, homosexual lifestyle, etc. It's misunderstood, it's misused, it's abused. But I also have to say that inside the church, quite often, it's ignored in terms of what Jesus is really teaching here. So let's read it together and then talk about it, starting at verse 1. He says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrites, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet, and turn and tear you to pieces." So there's a whole lot in that. And you'll often hear people who know nothing about the Bible quote this verse: "You're not to judge," when we start saying anything about, especially in American culture today, anything about sexual values, sexual ethics, sexual issues, the LGBTQ plus transgenderism, all of those kind of things. And what they're really saying is you're supposed to accept, you're not supposed to judge what's right and wrong. You're supposed to accept everybody's behavior. And it's not up to you, okay? And we could talk a lot about that. But the question then is, what is Jesus talking about? I think he's talking about the inconsistency of those of us who are his followers at times, and how we look at ourselves and how we look at others, not just in the LGBTQ plus community, but just other people in general. You'll remember back in chapter 5, and the Sermon on the Mount, this is one sermon Jesus taught, starting in verse 1 of chapter 5, going through chapter 7. And back in chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus said that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And go, wow, because the scribes and Pharisees were very religious, fasting every week, tithing on all of their income, experts in the law, the word, meaning they read it, they knew it, they studied it. They were in the synagogues on the Sabbath, very religious. And Jesus said, your righteousness has to exceed theirs. And he goes on in chapter 5 to talk about, the Old Testament said, don't murder. But I say to you, if you get angry with people and call them names and so on. In the Old Testament, you've heard it said, you should not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you look on a woman and lust after her, on and on. And so Jesus elevates his expectations. So now you come to chapter 7. Back in chapter 6, he talked about your motivation. Why do you do the religious things you do? Is it for recognition, or is it just okay with you if only God sees it? Do you really trust him with your material things? And at the end of chapter 6, well, what you do with your money says you do or you don't, no matter what your words say. And now he comes and says, so don't judge. You see the speck, the little splinter in someone's eye, but you got this big old log, this big old plank in your own. And the way you judge others is how you'll be judged. He's saying you've got to deal with your own sin before you worry about dealing with other people. And that sin in my life and your life may include our thought life, our attitudes, our motivations, not just the so-called big sins. And so he's saying it's hypocritical for us to see the sin in others and not be willing to let God help us deal with the stuff in our own lives. He's not teaching, however, that we are to not think of anything as being sinful. There are things that are sinful in our lives and other people's lives. Well, you can't know it's sin in my life, your life, or anyone else's life if there's not a judgment in the sense of what's right and wrong. And God is the one who establishes right and wrong. It's later in this chapter, starting at verse 15, that he said, you'll know who's true and false by their fruit. Well, to know what fruit is good and what fruit is bad requires judgment, requires discernment. So Jesus is never saying we are to not have discernment. He's not saying things that we can't say that something is sinful. But he's getting at us being hypocrites like the Pharisees were, who criticized the everyday folk for not following all their rules. Even the Pharisees were real religious, and they thought they were right with God, and these who didn't follow all their rules were not. And it's like Jesus is saying to them, can't you see the big old log in your own eye? And you're condemning all these others. You flip it for you and me. And it's like he's saying, you're talking about everybody else's sin, but you're ignoring what's going on in your own life. And that's hypocritical. But it doesn't mean we back away and say, well, I can't say anything is wrong, or I can't say anything is sinful. It's interesting that right after these words on judging, that he says in verse 6, don't give what is holy to the dogs or your pearls to the swine. Well, you have to know who's a dog and who's a swine. That requires discernment. In the Jewish culture, the dogs and the swines would have been those who wanted nothing to do with God. Jesus sent his disciples out on a teaching, preaching mission, and he said, if a village won't accept you, walk outside, shake the dust from your feet, and go on. In other words, we are to share the gospel with people, but sometimes there are some people who will blaspheme the gospel and blaspheme God, who ridicule and shake the dust off and move on, because there are lost sheep out there, whether they know it or not, who want to be found. Well, that requires some level of discernment, doesn't it? What Jesus is getting at is the self-righteousness. Remember, he's just talked about people who were fasting, praying, and giving to charity for recognition. God's recognition was not enough. They needed man's recognition. And he said, that's all the reward you're going to get. And then he moved into all this talking about money and God's kingdom. Because the truth is, in other parables, Jesus taught that money is the smallest thing God can entrust you with. And if he can't trust you with a little thing of money, why would he trust you with the bigger things of his kingdom? Your words say you trust him, but your actions say you really don't. And now here he says, but you're judging everybody else and not dealing with your own sin. That's the point Jesus is making. He's not saying anything about we are not allowed to say that adultery is sin, that we're not allowed to say that homosexual behavior is sin. We're not allowed to say that lying is a sin. No. What he's saying is deal with your stuff. That's what he's saying. Deal with your stuff. And when we do that, we don't minimize our own sin. We don't always think the worst of others. We don't always talk to others or about others only talking about their faults or their failures. And we don't assign motives to people when we don't really know what their motives are. That's judging that Jesus is talking about here. So deal with our stuff. Teach His word, share the gospel, but deal with our stuff. So that's the message for Matthew 7, or at least the first few verses of it. I'll see you tomorrow as we jump over to chapter 8, and I'll just tell you ahead of time, it's a little bit, longer chapters. A lot in chapter 8 we could talk about. We'll see what we're going to talk about. God bless you, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.